Okay, so I guess I'm on a free will kick lately. So I saw this video floating around. It looks like it's Majesty of Reason, Joe Schmidt, and us reviewing a Sapolsky versus Huemer debate. So maybe I would watch a bit of this. Um, uh, I think the Majesty of Reason channel is very cool. If you're not subscribed, notice I am. You should go do it. But and Joe's philosophy is very good as well. He has some papers on the Grim Reaper paradox, which I saw recently coming out and read, and were quite excellent. So I'm a big fan of his work. I'm not sure who this other person here. Oh, Dr. Taylor Sire. So let's go ahead and check it out. I wonder if oh, this is 2 hours. Um, Probably not going to check out the whole thing, but we could see some of it.
Do we have free will? And is free will compatible with everything we do being the inevitable consequence of prior conditions? Today, we'll be discussing these questions and more as we watch and discuss the opening statements in a recent debate on free will between Dr. Robert Sapolsky and Dr. Michael Huemer. I'm joined by Dr. Taylor Sear, who's a philosophy professor at Stanford University and who's done lots of excellent work on topics relating to free will, moral responsibility, divine foreknowledge, and even time travel, which is pretty fun. I put a link in the description to your website, Taylor,
Maybe
for the
that's
audience,
too
and a
fast.
link to your
Although I
wonderful
can
and amazing
hear
podcast,
time
The Free Will Show,
travel.
which everyone in my audience should immediately check out. But is there anything that you want to add before
A
we get into some of the
podcast.
philosophy?
Well, thanks for having me, Joe. It's good to be back.
So what podcast? It says it's in the description. Tyler's website, Free Will Show. That must be the name of the podcast. Okay.
On your channel. And yeah, thanks for plugging the podcast. In spring of 2024, we're going to have probably another 10 episodes or so on assorted topics. So for anyone who's interested in just kind of jumping in, seeing what people are working on
Spring of
today,
2024. So this was January 8th. Okay. So there's
temporary issues in
relatively.
the free will debate. That's, I think, any episode, they should be able to just jump in. They don't have to listen to any earlier ones. But the first couple seasons of the podcast provide a kind of overview of the free will debate. And sort of big news for our podcast, we're turning those first couple of seasons into a book with Oxford University Press. So hopefully that'll come out in
Cool.
2024. We'll see. We've got some proofing to do before then. The other thing I'll plug really quick, excuse me, is with Andrew Law and Neil Tognazini, I recently co-edited this Festschrift set of essays in honor of our advisor, John Martin Fisher, who is one of the kind of leading figures in the free will debate today. So
John
that's called
Martin
Freedom,
Fisher.
Responsibility, and Value, Essays in honor of John Martin Fisher. And I'll probably bring up his name later as we talk through. He's recently engaged in a couple different ways with Sapolsky's work, so I'll probably refer to him again.
Hmm.
I will put a link in the description to his review of Sapolsky's book because I
Yeah,
thought it was excellent and
likewise.
I very much liked it. So the
Mhm.
audience should check that out. Okay, so here's kind of an outline for the audience for
I
today.
should
First,
read
we are
that.
going to be defining terms, which is pretty important for the free will debate. Then we're going to be looking at Sapolsky's opening statement, after which we're going to be looking at Huemer's opening statement. Let's get into the key terms. First up is determinism. So Taylor, can you just tell the audience like what is determinism?
So the term gets used in a bunch of different ways, and we'll see once we start the video. Sapolsky offers a definition, but it's a little hazy. It's not fully fleshed out. But typically, when in the free will debate, when philosophers talk about determinism, they're talking about causal determinism, where that's the thesis that given the way things were at some past time, and given the laws of nature, there's only one way that things can unfold from that past time. And even still, like there's other ways of characterizing it that are a little bit more careful. But one of the common definitions from Peter Van Inwagen that gets cited a lot is that determinism is the thesis that there is at any instant exactly one physically possible future. So there's only one way that things can unfold given the way things are at some time and given the laws of nature. So that's the idea. And yeah, so some people think if determinism is true, then what we do is the inevitable consequence of the way things were in the distant past, long before there were any human beings, together with the laws of nature. There are varieties of determinism that aren't necessarily causal. So there might be some kind of logical determinism or fatalism having to do with the laws of logic necessitating everything that happens. More commonly discussed than that is the problem of sort of theological or divine determinism, where something about God's knowledge, or more typically God's choices, intentions, or decrees settle a unique future or make inevitable one future. So there are lots of determinisms in the free will debate, but usually people are talking about causal determinism, where it's the laws of nature that are sort of necessitating the future, and that's the sense of determinism that Huemer and Sapolsky are interested in.
Awesome. And then the next term
Interesting. I wouldn't have thought of those as different kinds of determinism. Different ways to bring out the problem of determinism. Um, Interesting.
would be free will. And this, of course, everyone means something different by free will. But
Yes.
can you just take us maybe a little bit about how philosophers, in particular within the free will literature, understand free will?
Yeah. Yeah. Even there's some disagreement about how to use the term by philosophers. So what most philosophers do, which is helpful, is they at least say what they're meaning by the term so that there's no kind of verbal dispute or talking past each other. At least that's the goal. So often colloquially, we talk about having free will when we talk about things being up to us or some things being a matter of our choice. Philosophers are usually interested in an adjacent concept of moral responsibility. So having free will is a matter of being in control of what you do in such a way that it could be, your fault when you do something wrong, or, you could be praiseworthy when you do something good.
Right. So
That's
this is one definition of free will that links it to moral responsibility. The other one links into your having to have done otherwise or something.
Sense of control or freedom that we're trying to capture with the term free will. At least that's what a lot of philosophers think. So one kind of recent and helpful development in the free will debate just in the last 40 or 50 years is that most philosophers have started tethering the term free will to the concept of moral responsibility. That way you can disagree about what's required for moral responsibility and so what sort of free will requires, but we're at least all talking about the same sort of issues.
There are also other ways, as you said, but I just think it's important to kind of lay that down. Basically free will as the ability to control our actions in a way needed to be morally responsible for them. I think that's just an important way that philosophers, it's a pretty dominant understanding among philosophers, at least working on free will. So I wanted to get that across for the audience. And then another crucial distinction is that there are two kind of different, at least maybe kinds of freedom or senses of freedom.
So what they're glossing over is that this other way of doing things, a more metaphysically loaded sense in which free will requires that you have the ability to choose in a way that you could have done something differently, which is a more older traditional way of framing this debate. But like he said, in the last 50 years or so, people have been talking more and more about the link of free will to moral responsibility. So that's a good way to bring it up. But of course, the reason for that being is that compatibilism in philosophy is a dominant view. And compatibilism says that while everything is completely determined, nonetheless, there are some determined systems which count as having free will in the sense of, not in the sense of being able to do otherwise, but in the sense of being able to control themselves in a way that's appropriate for blame and praise. So that's why this redefinition of the term free will, linking it to moral responsibility, allows the compatibilist to enter into the debate and say, yes, I think there's a kind of free will and there is a moral responsibility. And so that has been the subject of a lot of the debate. I think they're right.
That are an issue a lot in free will debates, and that's kind of like leeway freedom versus source of freedom. Sometimes they're called different terms. But can you just take us, like, what is this distinction? Are these different senses of free will? I'll turn it over to you.
And that's what was you
there are
just
two
saying?
among philosophers, at least working on free will. So I wanted to get that across for the audience. And then another crucial distinction is that there are two kind of different, at least maybe kinds of freedom or senses of freedom that are an issue a lot in free will debates, and that's kind of like leeway freedom versus source of freedom. Sometimes they're called different terms. But can you just take us, like, what is this distinction? Are these different senses of free will? I'll turn it over to
Leeway
you.
versus source. I don't know this distinction, so good. Let's hear it.
So leeway and sourcehood are good key terms, and I think this is very helpful for understanding different positions in the free will debate today. So start with leeway. Leeway freedom is like leeway in the sense of there being genuinely available alternatives to what you do. So you could go this way with what you choose, or you could go this way. It's like, this is owing to John Martin Fisher's example, but it's like walking through a garden of forking paths, and it's up to you whether you're going to take a right or left turn at this junction. And then, depending on which choice you make at that part of the garden, right, you'll come to another fork in the path later. And life is like that. We have various choices. We can perform,
In the old days, there was a blog called The Garden of Forking Paths from this phrase. So
various actions from among a set of alternatives to it. That's the idea of leeway freedom. Some people think that's it, what it is to have free will is just to have leeway in our behavior and in our choices. So it's something like having the ability to do otherwise, or having genuinely open alternative possibilities, something along those lines. There are others who think, and these aren't necessarily kind of incompatible with each other, there are others who think that free will is about being the source of your behavior. So to say that, I acted freely when I chose to brew coffee this morning instead of tea is to say that was really up to me. That was my choice. It wasn't something that, happened randomly or that I didn't have any kind of say in. It was my choice. And then the action that followed was my action.
Yeah, so what are they going to say? That this debate, Sapolsky seems like he would accept maybe the leeway stuff, even though, you're determined. There may be some option. No, and he's going to deny that. So maybe he's going to deny leeway. He's going to deny that you're the source of your actions for sure, since he thinks that's determined by your history. So he's going to deny. It feels like they want to say he's going to deny one, but not the other. But
so maybe that requires having alternative possibilities or leeway. There are some people who think sourcehood and leeway are kind of maybe not different sides of the same coin, but they're both kind of central to the concept of free will. But there are others, and this is one of the key debates in the contemporary free will literature, is there are other people who think that, well, you could have free will, could be up to you what you do, and that doesn't actually require leeway. It doesn't require having the ability to do otherwise. So yeah, there's lots of different ways of kind of carving up the positions in the free will debate today, and we'll probably get into some of those terms in just a minute. But even setting aside other camps and divisions among positions in the free will debate, this is one way of carving up the different positions, is in terms of whether leeway is what's emphasized or sourcehood, whether only one of those things is required and not the other, and so forth.
So then I guess the final thing that I want to cover is
I mean, you would want to point out that that's one way that you've defined the term free will. It seems like they didn't do that. They defined it in terms of moral responsibility and then point out there's two senses of freedom, but then there's two ways that you could be free then, or the will could.
compatibilism and incompatibilism. So what are these theses?
Yeah,
Oh,
so
yeah,
we've got
sorry.
determinism. We started with that term, and we've got free will. And you might think those just can't go together. And if you think that, then you're probably an incompatibilist. You think that free will and determinism are incompatible with each other. Um, we'll probably talk about this as we start watching the video, but there are some people who just assume incompatibilism. They think the problem of free will is the problem of free will versus determinism. Is determinism true, or do we have free will? Those are the sort of only options. But as the other term that you mentioned indicates, compatibilism, there are some people who think that those things don't rule each other out necessarily. So that you could
And
have
compatibilism is such a widely misunderstood view, even though it's a dominant view amongst philosophers. When you talk to ordinary persons about it, they often misunderstand it, at least at the beginning. It's
free
very
will even
easy
in a
to.
deterministic world. So maybe that's leeway freedom, maybe that's sourcehood freedom, but depending on what kind of compatibilist view you go for, you think free will, understood in the right kind of way, is actually compatible with determinism. There are at least some deterministic worlds where some agents, at least sometimes, act freely. That's the thesis of compatibilism. It's pretty minimal. Interestingly, it's the majority position among philosophers, contemporary philosophers. It's even the majority position among philosophers who work on free will.
Yeah.
It's not, I don't think it's got no problems. I am myself a compatibilist. I think there are big challenges to compatibilism. Maybe we could talk through some of that in a little bit. But interestingly, that term doesn't really come up in the debate that we're about to enter into. So we'll probably keep referring back to this point as we talk through the video. But many philosophers are going to disagree with these debate participants' points because of their compatibilism, their belief in compatibilism.
Yeah, and that was a point that I was making when I was talking about the Dennett video response to this debate. This is a different debate, obviously, but Sapolsky, same guy, just denies the possibility of compatibilism, doesn't see it as a real option. Um,
Exactly. And I just wanted to add that there are also lots of kind of subtle distinctions among kinds of compatibilism and incompatibilism, especially as they relate to those senses of freedom that we talked about earlier, the kind of leeway
Mm-hmm.
freedom and sourcehood freedom. One might think, like this is an option, one might think that, yeah, leeway freedom, the ability to do otherwise and have alternative courses of action genuinely available to one, maybe that is indeed incompatible with the truth of determinism.
Mm-hmm.
But so someone might also say, consistently, that sourcehood freedom is entirely compatible with determinism. And all you need for free will, in the sense of the ability to control our actions in a way needed to be morally responsible for them, is to have an appropriate kind of sourcehood freedom. And so then free will, in that sense at least, is going to be compatible with determinism, even if you think leeway freedom specifically is incompatible. And similarly, you can go in other sorts of directions. Like you
Right.
can mix and match which of these senses of freedom you think is compatible or incompatible with determinism. I just want to put that on the audience's radar because so often people say like, oh, you're compatible. It's like, you think I could have done otherwise, even though the truth of determinism is true? Well, not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily. They might think that that kind of leeway freedom is incompatible with determinism, even though we can have free will in the sense of, again, being able to be responsible for our actions because we're in control of them. That may
Mm-hmm.
be compatible. So I just want the audience to be incredibly careful when using these terms compatibilism and incompatibilism. I don't know if you want to add anything.
yeah, that's a very good point, I think, obviously, but also, I think that already we can see what Sapolsky's point is that is the leeway stuff isn't really what he's interested in. It's the past stuff, and whether the past determines negates you as being the source. That's the way that I would frame what his argument is going to be. So I wonder, it's going to be interesting to see what they say.
That.
Yeah, I think that's great. And one of the kind of positions that you mentioned there, one possibility of combining the different views is the position that Fisher holds, semi-compatibilism, which is, I guess, a bit more precisely whether or not determinism rules out the ability to do otherwise. And so leeway freedom. Even so, we could have sourcehood freedom, the kind of control we need for moral responsibility, even if determinism is true. So he might be fine with saying, yeah, leeway freedom, that's ruled out that's ruled out by determinism, but that wouldn't affect whether we're free in the sense that's required for moral responsibility. And that is my view too. And so that, because these positions kind of get elided in the debate, there are going to be places where I'm like, okay, I
But
don't
why is that semi-compatibilism? I'm not up on this literature, to be honest with you. So, okay, let's see
really
what
agree, but partly because they've sort of not considered this other, no pun intended, but this other alternative.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so with that out of the way, we define determinism, free will, just free will as the broad ability to control our actions in a way needed to be morally responsible for them. We also discussed two different senses of freedom, which might interact interestingly with that kind of broad notion of free will that I just articulated. And those two senses, of course, were leeway freedom, which is basically the ability to have done otherwise, having alternative courses of action available to you. And on the other hand, sourcehood freedom, which is essentially a matter of your actions being up to you and you kind of being the appropriate source of your actions and decisions. And then we went into compatibilism and incompatibilism and some of the subtleties there. Okay, so that's a little recap for the audience. And now let's get into the opening statements, beginning with Dr. Sapolsky.
this seems like an ideal way to start off because I could not imagine a starker contrast in views about the world between me and Mike. Basically, I think the world is entirely deterministic, and we can talk about quantum indeterminacy somewhere along the way, but I think it is deterministic enough that there's no free will. Mike, meanwhile, if I can turn you into a soundbite to match mine, I believe you believe that the world is not meaningfully deterministic and that we have free will. So we've got a nice contrast here, I think. Okay, so the logical thing
I did not know that was his view.
from my end is to start off, what do I mean by determinism? And using sort of a somewhat classical version, something happens and we ask, why did that happen? And recently, scientists, and by recently I mean in the last 500 years or so, recently scientists have figured out the answer. This just happened because of what came before. And that happened because of what came before that, and what came before that, and it's causality all the way down. And again, we can talk about the weird domain of quantum indeterminacy, which is an exception to that, and why I don't think it's relevant to free will. Okay, so this happened because of what came before, and let's translate that into the realm that we care about instead of like asteroids or something, which is someone does a behavior. And it's wonderful and compassionate. It's horrible and appalling. It's ambiguous in between. It's in the eye of the beholder, whatever. And we ask the classic human question, why did that person just do what they did? And one possible answer is because they just exercised free will. And what I would contend, and going through a whole series of steps with it, is they did what they did because of what came before, and what came before that, and came before that. Okay, let me translate this into the world that's sort of meaningful to us mammals and things like that.
I kind of flagged this before we started playing the video, but notice he says Sapolsky says he's going to define determinism, and he doesn't really offer a definition of determinism. He characterizes it as kind of explaining what happened in terms of what came before. He eventually talks about everything being caused by what came before. He says it's causality all the way down. And it very well may be that that's what our best scientific theories of the last 500 years show, is that everything that happens is explainable and perhaps even caused by something that came before. Now, interestingly, that's not sort of the scientific consensus. There's no consensus on that, but it's pretty plausible. So that everything is caused by what came before. But does that earn the label of determinism? Just about everyone in philosophy would say no, because it very well may be that everything is caused or explainable in terms of what came before, and yet it could be that it's indeterministically or probabilistically caused, right? Maybe there are some deterministic causes where, given this cause, it's inevitable that this effect happens, assuming the laws of nature. But it could very well be that the laws of nature are themselves indeterministic or probabilistic, such that given this set, this cause or this set of antecedent conditions, there's more than one way that things could unfold. Maybe this is 60% likely, this is 40% likely. And either way, whether we go the 60 or the 40 route, what happens is brought about by those antecedent conditions, and so explainable in terms of them. Now, it is trickier to make out exactly how we should understand indeterministic or probabilistic causation or explanation. Of course, philosophers have wrestled with this and they've spent a lot of time working on it. But yeah, just because of that, it shouldn't be thought that if we could somehow show that everything is caused, it follows that everything is deterministically caused. That's just not something that follows.
Right. He doesn't really say that, though. He says it's deterministic enough to rule out free will. So I agree he's being vague and everything. But what he actually says is whatever indeterminacy or probabilistic stuff there is not enough to say free will. So he at least is going to try to address that. Although the point that Taylor Sayer is making here is not related to the quantum stuff. I think it's more general laws of nature being probabilistic.
Notice also, and I kind of flagged this earlier too, Sapolsky is going to make the case for denying free will, saying that we don't have free will. And he thinks he'll get there so long as he can show that everything is determined or everything is caused, sort of, I think more accurately. Seen a problem in going from cause to determined, but also we've also seen reason to think that, just because something's determined might not mean that it's, not done freely, that say it's an action done by a human being, right? If compatibilism is true, it might be that the person performed an action, maybe made a choice, it was determined, and yet they did so freely. Right? We'd have to spell out exactly what the conditions for free action are and why they're compatible with determinism. But again, that's a dominant view in philosophy. So it's kind of surprising that he thinks that he can get to the conclusion that we don't have free will just from showing that everything is caused.
Yeah, he might probably be relying on the fact that the average person doesn't accept compatibilism. So the person who's reading his book is going to be an incompatibilist, and they're going to take this case as a case against free will. But I actually think that maybe he thinks he has an argument against compatibilism too. But I'm not really sure. I'm not an expert in this area, so that's why I'm listening to all this stuff.
Exactly, exactly. And I think there are two kind of salient points here, and I think these will just reverberate throughout his opening statement. And one is just like merely from the fact that there are factors beyond our control that influence us or even causally affect our behavior in certain ways, it doesn't follow that there are factors beyond our control that determine us, right? And that kind of goes to your distinction between, well, just because everything is caused by prior conditions, it doesn't mean that it's deterministically caused specifically. So that's one point. And then the second point is that, yeah, I mean, just assuming the truth of incompatibilism, which, I mean, maybe here we could go through at least some compatibilist models of free will to at least
Right.
help the audience see that it's like at least an open live possibility on the table that should at least be taken seriously. So I'll turn over to you to kind of go where you want with that question.
Yeah. So the more classical view is a leeway compatibilist view where even if determinism is true, we still could do otherwise than what we actually do. And the way that classically these kinds of compatibilists have tried to spell out how that could be the case, following folks in the early modern period like Thomas Hobbes and David Hume, they try to show that the ability to do otherwise should be analyzed in terms of certain kind of hypothetical conditionals, right? So like if I had chosen otherwise, I would have done otherwise, right? That could be consistent with me, being determined not to do otherwise. But yet if I had wanted to do otherwise, or if I tried or chosen to do otherwise, I would have done otherwise. That could still be true. And so some compatibilists have tried to make sense of the ability to do otherwise in terms of that kind of conditional analysis of abilities or can claims. I think there are big problems for that approach, and there are still kind of different ways of trying to develop it that avoid some of those problems today. So I think that is still a live option. But the other view that we hinted at earlier, John Martin Fisher view, the view that I like is that, well, you don't need leeway in order to be morally responsible. And this makes life a lot easier as a compatibilist because it really does look like determinism precludes leeway freedom. This is where I might agree with both of the debate participants. But on the other hand, I think there are good reasons to think that there's a difference between kind of random behavior or erratic behavior or like behavior that we might not even want to call behavior, like an action done while a person's sleepwalking that they have absolutely no control over on the one hand, and then behavior that's done for reasons where the agent seems aware of those reasons and is acting in
Right.
light of them. And I think we could
So
make the
this
distinction.
is the Dennett point about the skier and the boulder. That was exactly his point from the video that we watched before. Uh, the skier can become like the boulder can't become like the skier. So their difference there is the difference in control.
Between those two
But yeah, so I remember this. I mean, so I have a passing familiarity with the history of this stuff from graduate school and all that. So I remember the people who claim that you could have done otherwise and were compatibilists. And then there was a whole big debate about that. But why call the source thing semi-compatibilism? I mean, it still seems to me that Sapolsky's view is that you're not the source of your actions. So that he's not merely arguing against leeway freedom. But I don't think we'll have to let Sapolsky talk and see what he says.
Of behaviors, even if they were all determined. And
Yeah,
because
let's
I
go straight to
think
the
it really does look like, if you're sensitive to the reasons to do otherwise and to do what you are doing and certain other conditions are met, you could be morally responsible. I think that's compatible, like that free will in that sense is compatible with being determined. So yeah, I think yeah, they're different. I mean, that's even just barely scratching the surface of kind of compatibilist views on offer, and I haven't even spelled either of them out in any detail. But maybe the last thing I'll say here is perhaps it's fine for Sapolsky in the context of this debate to assume incompatibilism because Huemer, his interlocutor, is also going to assume incompatibilism. So that's sort of a shared point. But if we don't sort of flag to the audience of that debate that they're both assuming this massive debatable thesis. In fact, they're assuming the minority position among philosophers on this topic. I think it could be potentially misleading.
Yeah. So I don't have much to add there. I mean, yeah, there are people who think that yeah, maybe leeway is needed for free will in the sense of the control required to be morally responsible for our actions. But hey, that's compatible with determinism because we can understand leeway in terms of like, well, hey, if I wanted to do otherwise, I would, and that's true, even if determinism is true, etc. And there are more sophisticated proposals that, talk in terms of like dispositions, and you get all fancy about these can claims, these possibility claims, and how they potentially could be compatible with determinism, etc. But then there's this kind of other approach which says, well, yeah, maybe leeway freedom is indeed incompatible with determinism, but hey, you don't need that in order to have free will in the sense of the control required in order to be morally responsible, because you can still be appropriately reasons responsive. We can still sort of endorse our actions and commit to them, and we can kind of even desire to act upon the desires that we do and so on. So like we can meet all these conditions, which at least many compatibilists think are entirely sufficient for us being morally responsible for
Right.
our actions. So and that are indeed compatible with determinism. So
Right.
I just want to like make the audience aware that there are like sophisticated compatibilist models of free will in that broad sense. And so like this is not something that can just be like dismissed out of hand or anything like that.
Part
Yeah,
of
they're not really giving you the main argument for that claim, I guess, or the intuition behind it, which is that there are kinds of cases where you can see that the person couldn't have done something otherwise, but yet you still want to blame them. So the classic example involves putting a little brain implant into a person. Suppose that you want to, still this. Well, the classic case was a murder, but suppose you want to do something, whatever it is, you have the intention to do it, but there's also a neuroscientist who implants into your brain a microchip, which, if you ever change your mind, would zap you so that you did it anyway from inside. So there's a real sense in which you can't do otherwise. But you go on and form the intention, follow through, and steal or kill or whatever, and then people think, well, you're still kind of blameworthy there. You still did it you still planned it, intended to do it. The zapper never came into effect, so there's nothing that forced you to do it, but still there was something that guaranteed, that made you have to do it in a sense. So it was those kinds of cases which convinced a lot of philosophers that, gee, maybe there is some sense in which, even if you can't do otherwise, you're still responsible for your actions. But those are highly contentious. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so it's good to have these refresher courses on the background debate since I'm such a novice in this area.
why you made the decision you did had something to do with what was going on in the seconds before that. Amazing finding. Take people, stick them in a room with smelly garbage, and they don't know it's there, but smelly garbage, and on the average, people become more homophobic. And they will explain to you exactly the reason for their stance, and it's the smell in the room. Put somebody in a room where it smells of fresh chocolate chip cookies, they are more generous in economic gains. So that's influencing a decision that we would otherwise have said was about free will.
Do these survive replication? I know a lot of these kinds of studies were questioned, but even if, I'm not sure if these ones in particular were or were not. All right, let's finish up with this because I don't think I'm going to get through this. I want to see some more of this, but maybe I'll do a part 2.
How about minutes before?
Okay, so I just wanted to pause here and just situate the audience. So what Sapolsky is basically going to be doing here is he's saying he's going to be going through this array of factors that influence our actions and that are beyond our control. They influence our actions and decisions, and yet we're not responsible for them. We're not in control of them. And he's starting in the kind of seconds and kind of like milliseconds before action. And then he's tracing it to like minutes before action, and then hours before action, and then days, and then even before our birth. And he's just saying, like, look at all these things that seem to, at least this is one way to interpret him, look at all these things that seem to undermine our responsibility. Look at all these things that are influencing us, etc. It's not clear if he thinks that they directly undermine our responsibility or if they just show that determinism is true and that undermines our responsibility. I want to flag that as well because it's not actually clear which one of those he's arguing. But I did just want to situate the audience to what he's doing. He's just going through all these factors that are influencing us. And then before I turn it over to you, Taylor, to offer any comments, I also want to say that we should at least be kind of careful and cautious with some of these psychological findings because there's this huge crisis in psychology and especially like behavioral psychology and social psychology, which is called the replication crisis. And it basically that a lot of these kind of findings that sound like, whoa, really surprising and really kind of cool and kind of fancy and surprising and so on, actually a lot of them just can't replicate when you actually perform the tests again. And there are various reasons for that. Some of them have to do just with the tricky nature of social interaction and how complex we are. Some of them have to do with bad research practices and p-hacking and so on. But I just want the audience to be aware, to have a healthy dose of skepticism towards a lot of these claims that seem really kind of surprising and that you might find in like pop psychology things like, oh, there was this study where like if you're at the bottom of an escalator, you're more likely to donate than if you're at the top or something, where like a lot of these actually have failed to replicate and so on. I think there's a healthy grain of salt that should be that should be used whenever these kind of findings are put forward. That's not to say that we can't trust science, of course, but we just need to be very careful in trusting science. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I agree. We should be careful. I guess what's even more concerning to me is even if we had no reason to be suspicious about the results of any of the studies, it's not clear to me whether Sapolsky wants to say, given this set of examples that he's given, it must be the case that every human action is similarly kind of causally influenced by things outside of our control. I mean, he gives a lot of examples, and a lot of them are troubling. I mean, it could be that some of these studies are overblown, but some of them are troubling even to me. And but in order to avoid a kind of hasty generalization, like when you have smelly garbage in the room, you're not going to act freely, that sort of thing. You got to think there's some underlying reason why, in every case, no matter what conditions you're in, no matter what your genes are and so forth, in every case, yeah, it's inevitable what you do given the sort of causal conditions or something along those lines. To go that route, though, is to get away from the scientific studies and into the philosophical arguments for determinism and then for incompatibilism. And he doesn't quite go there. So that's something I would just flag too, is there's a reason to take the studies with a grain of salt, but there's even further kind of philosophical worries about the generalization that he makes from the scientific studies. And if people are interested in hearing from scientists who are more well-versed in the philosophical issues kind of underneath the surface here, to plug my podcast again, on the third season of the Free Will Show, the third set of like 10 episodes, we interviewed a bunch of philosophers and a handful of scientists on issues in neuroscience, psychology, and physics having to do with free will. So there's an episode on situationism, which is the kind of thing that Sapolsky is interested in and what we've just listened to. But then there's neuroscientists talking about some of the other things that he'll get into. So people can check out those interviews too.
Yeah, and I especially love the episode on like the Libet or Libet experiments.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people just tout those as like refuting free will or like
Right.
whatever, and it's like there are so many problems with that inference. It's so overwhelmingly hasty, and
It's true. But let's get back to Sapolsky.
but anyway, so I highly recommend checking that out. There's actually really interesting philosophical issues that it raises. There's another point here where it's like these findings, as Sapolsky himself noted there, are like based on averages, right? So like on average, like the mean response is that you'll be a slightly more homophobic or something like that. Like, okay, like what about the people that sort of didn't? Just because on average this happens, it doesn't mean that it happens to literally every single person on every single occasion. Like maybe some people are just more susceptible to that, and maybe some people are indeed then have some diminished control in their homophobia or whatever. But that it's so far away from the conclusion that he's ultimately trying to get at. And of course, maybe he's trying to build a cumulative case and so on. Like, well, just look at all these different factors, and maybe he's making an inductive, kind of inductive inference that
Right. What I see him as doing is trying to build an inductive cumulative case that we aren't the source of our own actions.
given that our actions and decisions are influenced in these sorts of ways, we have reason to think that they're influenced in boatloads of other ways of which we're unaware and so on. So, we need to be fair to Sapolsky as well. But as we rightly point out, first, we need a grain of salt with respect to a lot of these studies, just because of the replication crisis and so on. Secondly, it's a pretty hasty generalization to say, well, just because you're in a kind of when you smell garbage, you're a little bit more likely to be homophobic, or if you smell cookies, you're a little bit more likely to be more generous or whatever. We cannot infer that thereby it applies to all different sorts of situations, especially when you're like reflecting on a decision for months and you're consulting advice and so on. Like there are so many different ways that we make decisions, and not just these kind of these sorts of decisions that he's focusing on. So hasty generalization is another one, and then the third point is like, even granting him all this stuff, like it's based on averages, and not everyone is going to fall into that class of indeed being more homophobic upon smelling garbage. Just those points I think are important to emphasize here.
How about in the minutes before what's happened there? That's going to be relevant also. Minutes like, how long has it been since you've eaten a meal? One classic study showing the single best predictor of whether judges are going to make a judgment in favor of defendants is a function of how long has it been since they've eaten a meal. The longer it's been, the less open they are to an argument in favor of the defendant. And that has since been shown, the longer since a meal, the more likely you are to turn down somebody's loan application if you're a bank executive. The less likely you are to spend time looking at somebody's CV before deciding not to hire them. So those were influences in the minutes before. How about in the hours to days before? And that's talking about hormone levels and some amazing stuff. If, for example, someone has altered your levels of a hormone called oxytocin and raised that levels, you are now more likely to cheat to help out teammates in some sort of competitive setting. Otherwise, you wouldn't do that. Wow, why did you cut that corner? And here's my
It's called favoring the in-group, by the way.
Rational free willish explanation. And part of it is instead because your hormone levels had something to do with it. But how about
So I think that's an interesting point to pause. Like, do you think that there's a conflict between these kind of rational level explanations in terms of reasons on the one hand, and on the other hand, these explanations that cite kind of non-rational factors like hormonal influences, situational, environmental influences, and so on? He's like saying, well, whereas we would kind of colloquially tend to attribute them to these reason-based explanations, instead we these non-reason-based explanations. I wonder what you think about him kind of contrasting those.
I haven't thought too much about this. I guess I am sympathetic to the point he's making, which is that like if you can show that it's like way more likely that someone's going to act this way rather than another, if you knew, oxytocin levels or something like that, I would start to think, well, maybe what's going on in their head, the sort of reasons explanation we might give for their action is, to use a philosopher's term, epiphenomenal. It's sort of this byproduct that's not really doing any causal work in explaining the behavior. Or maybe it's like, an after the fact rationalization of what was going on chemically. I just don't think that that's what we find from the studies, is that we have that kind of overwhelming explanation in terms of yeah, something at the sort of physical and non-rational level. There are other people who think those kinds of explanations just don't compete at all. But I don't know if you were told like if I were to like, up your oxytocin levels and then it would be basically inevitable that you make this sort of choice and yet you'd still think I'm doing it for this reason. I think you'd start to worry that that is a kind of,
Yeah.
non-causal byproduct. I don't know. What do you think,
Yeah,
Jim?
I mean, I think I might worry. I mean, I'm not sure. Like, I think some of these conditions are simply making certain reasons more salient to us. Like if they make certain reasons more salient to us, we're more likely to act on them and take them into
Yeah.
consideration and give them more weight in our deliberation and so on. And it could still be on sort of that basis that we perform the actions. So although
Yes.
there's this tight correlation between the high oxytocin levels or whatever and our performing certain actions, it doesn't seem to kind of screen off the influence of the relevant reasons, or it doesn't necessarily do that. Again, I'm not saying that this is in fact the case. I just need to show that he hasn't proved he hasn't proven his case, right? He hasn't shown that it's the oxytocin that's really responsible for it, and that it sort
Right.
of screens off the reasons. What if here's an alternative possibility that he would have to rule out? What if the oxytocin levels just make certain reasons more salient to us and allow us to kind of have a clearer vision of the of certain reasons that are favoring our actions? Well, then if we go on to then act on those reasons, and indeed having more reasons more salient does indeed make us more likely to act upon them,
Right.
then we can have a reason-based explanation here, even though it's highly correlated with like the high oxytocin levels. And if your oxytocin levels weren't that high, you wouldn't have acted that sort of way. But that's simply because there's a mediator here, which is the reasons that were made more salient. So
Yeah, but that's his whole point is that you may be the sort of person who's going to have those hormone reactions, whereas I may not. And what explains that is something that's out of our further back control. So I get I get what Joe's saying here. I like it, but I don't think it really counts against Sapolsky's argument.
I don't know. I have
Yeah.
I have some skeptical worries about this.
Yeah, I think maybe we could add to you can think very clearly control comes in degrees. So
Yeah.
I have more control than my 6-year-old son when it comes to making ordinary decisions, when it comes to, various skill behaviors. But of course, like something's coming in degrees doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or that if you were to have less of it, you wouldn't have it at all. And it might be that, free will, I mean, a lot of people understand that in terms of the control required for moral responsibility. Maybe free will itself comes in degrees. And so the factors that Sapolsky's citing here might mitigate or reduce freedom to some extent, but that doesn't mean that we don't have free will.
Right. I think that's another really helpful point. And I mean, just think that's another element of sort of hastiness in his case. Like, even like, I think the best case scenario for him is like, yeah, all these do seem to at least diminish our control in certain ways.
Mhm.
Like, maybe we should revise our views and think that we're less in control than maybe what we ordinarily think. But that doesn't mean we're totally not in control and that our blaming and punishment practices are never justified and so on. We can't get to the no free will thesis on the basis of this sort of reasoning.
Right.
And yet another thing here, again, I want the audience to keep in mind that like a lot of the things that he's citing are still just averages and so on. Like, even though that you will be able to find the people who have the higher oxytocin and yet don't do the thing in question, right? Again, keep in mind the thing about averages, keep in mind the thing about hasty generalization, even if this applies to certain cases where you have oxytocin levels being high and so on, it doesn't follow that that's the case when you have kind of normal oxytocin levels in other sorts of domains, especially when you're thinking about going to a certain school and you've been deliberating about it for months and you've
Right.
sought advice and so on. Like, there's so many different actions that we perform and so many different conditions that it's just very hasty to kind of generalize. But
Instead, in the weeks to months to years before. And suppose you're a cop and you have gone through some sort of trauma in the past and you have PTSD. And as a result, your brain works differently. A structure in your brain called the amygdala has changed its function. And we can even describe down to the level of molecules how that has happened. And as a result of that, you look at somebody who is holding a cell phone, and in under a tenth of a second, your amygdala is more likely to decide that that's actually a handgun, and you pull the trigger. And we all know the relevance of that to everyday life. Okay, so I just freely decided that looked like a handgun and decided to shoot. PTSD will change that. All sorts of other sort of implicit cues will change that as well. But it's not just like years to decades ago. Go back to childhood. Childhood, how much adversity were you exposed to? People in the child development literature refer to these things called ACE scores, adverse childhood experiences, and you can get an official ACE score. Were you exposed to psychological trauma? Were you exposed to physical trauma? Were you exposed to sexual trauma? Did you observe it in your home? Was there somebody incarcerated in the family? A whole checklist, and you get your ACE score. And amazingly, for every step higher in your bad news ACE score, you have about a 35% increased likelihood of antisocial aggression by the time you're in your 20s, if you're a male, and about a 35% increased likelihood, if you're a female, of a teenage pregnancy, having nothing to do with your decisions whether or not to stick up the liquor store or not, but the sort of brain that was constructed in your childhood by how adverse your environment was. But we can push it even further back.
There are cases where, given really unfortunate circumstances in someone's childhood, when we hear about the trauma they faced, how their parents treated them, and so forth, it might be that we feel ambivalent about their say, bad behavior as an adult. There's a famous case of this discussed by Gary Watson, case of Robert Harris, where he committed some seriously egregious crimes. And when you hear about how he did it, what he said afterwards, the manner in which he did it, you're appalled. You feel indignation. You blame him immediately. But then you hear about the way that he was treated uh, before birth and after, and you hear how his unfortunate circumstances kind of, it seems like it shaped the life that he would then go on to live in a way that seemed like it was outside of his control. And so we feel like, well, maybe it wasn't his fault that he ended up becoming like this and then therefore doing these really bad things. Yeah, we feel a kind of ambivalence about Robert Harris. Does that mean that no one has free will? I mean, you might think, well, for those of us that didn't have unfortunate, childhood circumstances, we're lucky. Like it wasn't up to us what our parents were like, what kind of circumstances they found themselves in, and so forth. Um, and so, yeah, it might be partly a matter of luck whether we have those circumstances or not, and whether we're able to kind of control our behavior later on. So even if Sapolsky's right about certain cases, like maybe like Robert Harris's case, undermining freedom, it wouldn't follow that everyone lacks freedom. So I guess that's the thing I'd point to there. And
I
this
wonder
isn't.
why it wouldn't follow if Sapolsky's point is that this generalizes, and that even in the other cases you're going to have things like this going on, but just going in different directions. So yeah. Okay, well, this is getting long, so let me pause it here and then we'll come back and do a part two on this. I like having the commenters along because I don't know a lot about the history between when I last had a class on this in the 90s and now. So I haven't kept up with the debate, so I do think it's helpful. But I also want to hear the debate, so I do wish they would go on with it. But maybe I should go on with it.